Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. I think probably the most important thing that we should be talking about over and over again in the self-sovereign identity space is adoption. I think we're at a point where we have the right standards, we have the right technologies, we have the right frameworks in place to push things forward. And it's just about getting buy-in and getting adoption going. So I guess that's the first thing I just want to focus on for the discussion today. And then we'll get into a couple of topics that you both feel are quite important drivers towards adoption that maybe aren't focused on enough. But if we just start with the general topic of adoption, and I'd be curious, how do we define adoption? Because I think we often get confused with terminology and what we're trying to do in the space. We talk about self-sovereign identity, which is really just a bunch of principles that we try to follow. When we start talking about digital trust, well, maybe it's a bit of a broader conversation than just digital identity or digital credentials. If we talk about verifiable credentials, it's its own specific thing. So when you're looking at adoption, from what lens are you looking at it, and how would you define the whole conversation around adoption?
Thanks, Matthew. I'll take that. First of all, thank you for having us in the podcast. A long time we wanted to have a conversation with you. To answer your question, the lens we always look at adoption is from the SSI perspective, I'd say, or verifiable credentials, in the sense that it is a transformative architecture. We would be moving from the way we do things now in terms of authentication and accessing services online to a whole new architecture. So that for me is the adoption that we want to drive, how to slowly transfer all of these users from one authentication architecture in the internet to a user-centric and more privacy-preserving architecture. So I guess the short answer is we would be looking at adoption from the self-sovereign identity lens or perspective.
I don't know if this is an easy question to answer, but how would you look at measuring adoption? Do you start within a geographical context or within a specific vertical or industry? What kind of signals or KPIs would you look at if we're looking at how adoption is going in this space?
Well, to me, adoption has to happen at global level, in the sense that the way SSI achieves its full potential when it is deployed across multiple countries and across multiple sectors and use cases. And as such, I would prefer to look at adoption from that global perspective, from that internet architecture perspective. And internet has no really physical frontiers. Now, it is true that adoption is happening a little bit more at national or regional levels. And adoption will have different paces depending on what are you looking at the specific industry. For instance, today, the higher education industry is an early adopter, while other industries are lagging behind, maybe early majorities or late majorities. Same thing happens at geographical level. There are some countries much more advanced in having industries and governments and regulators involved in developing a national strategy involving, let's call it user-centric identity or self-sovereign identity than others. So definitely there we will see different paces for adoption in different industries, use cases, and countries. But I think that we should measure the whole world in terms of adoption and see if SSI finally achieves its promised success, I would say.
And it's funny because I don't think anyone I'm sure you have a similar experience. When people start learning about this stuff and what's possible, everyone thinks it's a good idea. So it's not like there are any people that don't see this as the future or a good idea or a better way of doing things. And I guess a promising thing, at least yourselves being in the European Union, is that we'll see how it plays out. But having, I guess you could call them profiles being defined, right? Both on the technological side of things, the standard side of things, and also on the legal governance side of things, like a little more specifications, hopefully is going to make it easier for the private markets to start adopting these sorts of solutions. Because in reality, we're not really talking about anything very novel, right? Like we've had signed data for a long time. We've had cryptography that allows us to do that for a long time. I think some of the advancements in how we manage public key infrastructure, some of the advancements in how we link this stuff to human trust or governance models, these are kind of all new things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I think if there are bodies that are able to start specifying, because there are so many standards, so many technologies, I think it's very complicated and cumbersome for someone just trying to learn about the space. So I think starting to define these as more profiles or implementation guides, I think we're moving in that direction, and hopefully that's going to be helpful for people just picking it up and not having to learn and understand every single piece that exists.
Well, it's funny because I remember when we started over 5 years ago already, that my initial bet was that the private sector was going to adopt this, in particular the financial sector that was really suffering from ever more complicated onboarding processes. They could reduce costs while improving user experience. So I certainly saw a lot of short-term benefits for the private sector. So I thought that the adoption would be driven by private sector and then somehow regulated and adopted by the public sector. But Europe, and I would say that in many other countries as well, the other way happened. Like governments and regulators started to take an interest in self-sovereign identity and this architecture and all the promised benefits in terms of added security and privacy. Europe is in particular very fond of privacy, and that definitely accelerated adoption. It was something I never thought could happen, and it happened. It is governments and regulators, the European Commission, really taking a step forward before the private sector did and say, hey, this is good for us. Let's implement this at regional level. So Europe was very visionary, in my opinion, in that regard, and having the European Commission draft an amendment for the electronic identification regulation that was already in place for EIDAS, and taking so many concepts from self-sovereign identity and embedding that into a regulatory mandate. In particular, what I think it was very interesting to see is that it was going to be made mandatory for all member states. So now adoption is not a matter of trying to really provide that value added to drive adoption, but rather for regulatory compliance. And there is no stronger force that regulatory compliance for driving adoption.
Like if we just use the financial sector and we kind of look at if like it's a common use case of doing a know your customer check under anti-money laundering regulations, like people talk about this use case over and over again and the value of reusable KYC credentials type of things. And how digital transformation happened in that space was you had every single relying party, like every bank, every financial institution would have kind of a vendor that would provide them with their identity proofing solutions that would allow them to do that. We've seen that really accelerate over the past few years as there's been more and more digital interactions throughout the world. And what I'm starting to see more now is that I'm starting to see more reusable kind of credentials, but they're still stuck to platforms. Like we just had one recently learned about in Canada, this company called Clear, who does a lot of like ID proofing stuff for the travel industry. Well, they're starting to offer ID verification or checks for LinkedIn users in Canada to be able to verify that people are actual humans or who they claim to be type of thing. But the thing is with this model is like, okay, I'm able to maybe save some costs as a relying party because I'm sharing these costs within an ecosystem, but I'm still dependent on a specific platform like Clear, a specific vendor type of thing. So they're not really based on open standards. They're not portable. They're not interoperable. You don't have all these things in there. And I had the same thesis as you, let's say 5 years ago, thinking that there would be a lot driven in the private sector, but I don't think the problem is like there's nothing stopping a company like Clear or anyone in that space from starting to use the open standards or technologies that will allow for more interoperable, open, privacy preserving consumption. It's just they don't really have an incentive to do so. And that's where I feel like the public sector coming in, you do need there's a public good aspect in this space, right? Because beyond the technology, beyond the standards that we use, if there's no profiles being set, if there's no kind of governance, legal support being set, it becomes kind of difficult for the private sector to say, hey, I want to be an early adopter, or I want to jump onto this. So it's an interesting space because it is a bit different than how the internet works today, right? Where there's not like the governance of the internet. There is some kind of involvement from governments, but generally like it's a very distributed, open type of thing. So it is interesting to see how these digital trust, I guess, is meshing with the existing legal public sector system and how important that's going to be for adoption.
And yeah, we cannot forget, I guess, the challenges of adoption. Somehow SSI is really not an easy pitch. It as you mentioned at the beginning, like once you tell a story about SSI, everyone thinks it's a good idea, but it's not something that you can explain in its full, really explaining the full implications of transitioning the digital world and also extending it to the physical world in just 5 minutes. You really need more time. You really need education. And in particular, I think also that it's not solving one single problem either. So somehow explaining SSI is not helping. It's not helping towards its case and adoption.
Yeah, that kind of gets into we want to focus on a couple main drivers that we think are very important for adoption in this conversation. One being communication, and then the second one, which we'll get to later in the discussion, being around user experience and design. And so you kind of led in to this, but like, what is communications 101 that like we're not doing or we should be doing versus like what is SSI specific, which makes it more complicated? Like we're talking about this a bit, but why is it more complicated to explain SSI than, let's say, a generative AI product, which no problem explaining it, it's seen adoption, stuff like that. So maybe what are some of the challenges in communicating and marketing SSI?
Well, I would definitely leave the mic to Esther. She's been leading all the marketing and communication efforts at Gataca. Perhaps as an introduction, I would say that it is what I would call a squared chicken and egg problem. Because it's not only about getting two sides of a market together, it's really an ecosystem with 3 parties involved, not only 2, like in a typical marketplace. So we're complicating the ecosystem with a 3-sided market. And also we are targeting different multiple use cases in multiple geographies. So I think that's the underlying cause of why explaining SSI is not easy. But please, Esther, share us your experience and the challenges in your mind.
Yeah, so I would say that as Irene touched a bit, first of all, like the ecosystem, it's a really complex ecosystem. We have not just like one specific target audience as we would see on specific technologies or different type of products. We have to first identify who to target, but the problem in this case for SSI, sometimes it's that with numerous potential applications cross industry and cross countries, the challenge becomes determining where to begin. So we usually see that it is innovators and early adopters for like the innovators and early adopters for technologies are tech enthusiasts or like people that it's already like tech savvy. And in this case, like for SSI could have worked like that, but the market, it's a bit more difficult. So we see that for building trust, it is easier rather than those tech enthusiasts, like it's easier with an organization-driven adoption. So we see, like as Irene said earlier, like, governments and education are the ones at the head at the moment. It is there. The main challenge would be first, like to see and identify that audience, also like educating that audience. So we as a marketers, we need to invest significant effort in educating the audience about a new way of managing their personal data and its advantages compared to traditional identity systems. And this education, like, it is complex because of the SSI ecosystem. Like, we have multiple stakeholders, on the one side, the users, and also the verifiers and the issuers. And we need to market for each of them, tailor their messaging, see what are their interests, concerns, the pain points, the problem that we really want to solve, and that it will really connect with them. Also, like for educating, like the challenge is the way that we are speaking to them. So we see, as a general, in the SSI world, like we use a lot of technical jargon. We use a lot of complex vocabulary that we need to be conscious of, like, to who we are talking. So it is a challenge to simplify technical concepts, but at the same time, like, balancing, not oversimplifying or omitting crucial information. We need to be aware that it's not the same talking to someone that it's on the Web3 space and it's familiar with concepts like decentralization or blockchains versus a regular person that has no doesn't have knowledge of these concepts. And on the other side, I would say, like, another challenge is more on the once we have identified the audience, we have educated them, converting that audience. I think as a general, we see that the problem is that we need to sell a solution, not the technology. Like, it's not about SSI, but also about finding a problem and selling a product that uses SSI and that solves that problem. And then also, it's about addressing, once they are educated, those misconceptions and resistance that we are seeing at the moment. Like, we are seeing concerns about security, data control, or that the audience perceives complexity. Those are like problems and challenges that we must face. And then also the lack of references. Unlike mature technologies, as I might lack well-known success stories or reference that early adopters can relate to, and this can create uncertainty among potential adopters. So I would say those would be like a bit of an overview of the challenges. We can go also into, obviously, the solutions to those challenges that we are seeing for marketing SSI.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Mentioned kind of we use a lot of jargon, technical terms sometimes too. We've had similar experience where we've just really confused customers we're talking to, even just using issuers and verifiers. Those terms, like, are just not applicable or just don't make sense in their scenarios. So it's kind of like, how do you level up off of that technical stack that we're all very familiar and invested in because we've helped move this over the past few years? And how do you move more into, like you said, the solutioning mode, that you're just talking about solving a business problem rather than talking about the underlying technology? I think even something like ChatGPT I just mentioned earlier, like, I don't think anyone understands how these models work underneath the UI, and it's seen adoption because they don't have to understand this. It just kind of works to solve specific problems. So it seems like it's a similar path that we need to take in this space.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think it is important that depending on who in the ecosystem we are talking to, we need to tailor that messaging. So we understand that if you're talking to the end users, they don't really need to know the specifics of the technology, what it's working behind. But still, there is an education point, like they need to know, understand, and be educated on how to do a new way of onboarding, or how not to use the typical username and password. So there is still a lot of education to be done, but it's true that we don't need to use like really techie jargon, really complex vocabulary, that for the end users. But if you are talking with issuers or verifiers, who we will be selling our technology, at least in Gataca, what we are selling as a product, it's for the issuers and verifiers. They really need to understand, and they want to understand the technology behind. So that's where I was meaning on, we really need to balance who we are talking to, because we are talking to the three of them at the same time, but depending on the moment and the stakeholder that we are discussing with, like, we really need to balance the type of vocabulary that we're using, also the value proposition for them. So for users will be more on privacy, the ease of use that they are going to get, like how SSI will simplify their day-to-day and online interactions, also about empowerment. But in case of when you're talking to verifiers, it is more about the reduced friction that they will have for their processes, the increase in trust and security that the technology provides, cost savings. And for issuers in this case would be more on more control and streamlined, like credential issuance, like how SSI simplifies the issuing and managing credentials, and reduce administrative overhead for them. So it really depends on who you are talking to, and then making sure that the messaging is tailored absolutely to them.
One example of that is it becomes kind of an art in explaining how this all works, and that art depends on your audience. But now if you think about a simple channel that every single company in this space has, which is the website. And you really need to drill all the messages down into a few landing pages. And then there is a difficult decision to make. Who are you targeting in your website? The three of them, like the three stakeholders, all regions, all use cases. Like this is when it gets truly complicated. In the one-to-one educational sessions with potential stakeholders, it becomes a little bit easier, because you just understand who they are within the whole ecosystem and what their interests are, and you adapt the message for that specific person. But then you need to deliver general materials like the website or a company's presentation deck. And then it's when it gets really complicated, because the audience is so broad and the potential readers are so different that we feel there is a lot of work still to do on that end.
Do you think it's easier to target just one, if we're talking about there's different roles, there's an issuer, a holder, and a verifier? Is it easier just to target one, like an organization or an entity that just represents one of those, and then you kind of supply the rest? Or is it easier to target entities that will be both issuers and verifiers maybe at the same time? It's more of a closed ecosystem. It may not reap the ultimate value right away that like an open ecosystem will reap. I think we could all agree the bigger the ecosystem grows, the more everyone kind of benefits in the ecosystem. But is it easier to just communicate these kind of closed ecosystem sales off the bat? And if I go back to my example of, it seems like these identity proofing companies now have kind of shifted their messaging and are talking about just reusable data, reusable credentials. It's not necessarily open, but what they're doing is they're just really solving the supply of trust or of credentials, and they're just selling that directly to relying parties or end users. So should we follow the same type of thing, or is it really about bringing parties together in an ecosystem? I'd be curious of how you communicate this, or how you go about this when you're engaging with prospective clients.
Well, focus is always a driver of business success. The more focused you are, the more likely you will really nail down the messaging and the value proposition. I somehow feel that that's not possible in our industry. I mean, keeping focus, because if you disregard the needs of the other stakeholders in the ecosystem, you're not delivering the whole picture. It's definitely, you need to take a side in the sense that, are you targeting businesses or are you targeting end users? And I've seen both approaches happening. For instance, we are a clear B2B company or B2G company, if you will, but we're definitely not a B2C company. And as such, all our messaging is way more focused on the B2B side of the ecosystem. But I've seen at the time, I remember, for instance, Avast having a pitch more in the B2C side of the ecosystem, trying to target their end users. Clearly, they came from a different perspective. They already had antivirus in a huge B2C market, and that seemed like a natural path for them. But still, even if you choose one of these kind of major sites, you still need to have a further focus. Like, are you targeting a specific region or a specific use case? And I think that's kind of necessary at the beginning. Getting too broad, you risk missing your intended audience.
Yeah, I would say that we need to keep it broad at the beginning, but also because SSI at the end has so many applications, but at the same time, the industry is already focused on some specific use cases. So, for example, in Europe, it is the European Union who has taken the lead through the large-scale pilots initiative. And we are seeing that the focus is on 12 different use cases. And we are seeing that focus, it's really good in terms of being a catalyst for adoption in those specific use cases. If it would not be a bit more focused, would be a bit maybe too many use cases or too many industries to target. So that is one point. Also, like, we need to focus on the industries where SSI can provide significant value and showing interest also. So for instance, sectors dealing with sensitive personal data like healthcare, finance are one of the big ones, and those requiring security identity verification, so like government. So the applications are really vast, but at the same time, there is a focus. I think there is a focus on a specific use case, on a specific industries, and those will be the ones leading SSI at the beginning, and later the adoption will get to the rest of industries. But yes, there is a focus, I would say.
I think like in most, if we just talk about both consumer and enterprise use cases, companies or products build a lot of brand recognition over time, and the consumers of these products will trust these brands that kind of will do specific types of interactions for you. In the SSI space, where you're going to have different applications that are very much separated from the protocols or the data layers, the governance models, stuff like that, do you think it's more difficult to achieve kind of a strong brand recognition in the space, seeing that in a real open kind of world, like there's going to be so many different niche products or different variations of products and stuff like that? Do you think it becomes more difficult to build a trusted brand in the space when ultimately the space should just be open?
Honestly, I don't think we will face that problem. It also depends on what region and what specific product you're talking about as a vendor provider. And let me explain. In Europe, there will be a certification process. In order to be a wallet provider, you need to be certified. And that certification is what gives you trust. It's like it's your stamp to the market that you can be trustworthy. Now, in other countries or regions, that may not be available, like a certification that really guarantees that you as a vendor provider are abiding to the standards, to the specifications, to the minimal security requirements, etc. Both kind of situations have their own challenges. For instance, in Europe, if there is a specific country that only certifies one wallet, then what happens with the rest of vendors, right? Is there any open market at all? And that's when you come down to the specific products. I think that wallets itself, like for end users or even for legal entities, we will see a myriad of wallets in the market, really a myriad. Some of them may be certified and available for government's use. Some of them will be for other use cases, but definitely there will be an open market of wallets out there. And in my opinion, the industry's aim is to offer that choice to the end user. It's important for many countries to offer the end user that choice. In those cases, I think it will be, it's up to the company, to the vendor, to build their own reputation, and then it will work like in any other market. Now, where you have a certification process or for products different than the wallet, that's a little bit more difficult to predict, because it all depends on interoperability. The world in SSI should work fully interoperable, meaning that software components for issuing authorities or for relying parties, for those verifiers, they will likely be more in an open market, particularly for the private sector. So they will behave, in my opinion, very similar to how wallets will behave. But then if you're talking about the public sector, then I think there will be some entry barriers. Those that have been there earlier on and have been able to develop a reputation, they might develop some network externalities very difficult to crush by a competitor.
Another topic when I think about communication in SSI, there's the word identity in the acronym SSI, and I've seen different places throughout the world, but we are myself being in the Canadian market, we do have to deal with this at times, is that like the term digital identity has become a bit of a bad term just for political reasons, because it's been weaponized. It's not necessarily that the people weaponizing digital identity necessarily know too much about it, and that actually like the stuff that we're working on is to hopefully give more privacy and control to citizens, but it has become just a term that is just being used to say like government's trying to overreach, government's trying to control you, we're going to end up with a Chinese credit score or system, whatever they call it there. Is that a reality in Europe as well when you're talking to either public sector or private sector? Is that something you have to take into consideration when you're communicating about your products and services?
Yeah, I think in Europe also there are like some, well, in all markets, I would say that especially when it's technology that it's not known, that it's unfamiliar for the general public, there are a lot of misconceptions and resistance, and it's our work to address those misconceptions head on and provide also credible sources for users to verify the information. Like, I think in Europe, at least, the European Union is really doing a really good job in terms of being the leaders in terms of privacy. So we started some years ago with the GDPR, and we've become kind of like a reference in that area. And I think with the right sources, with the right educational content, which this is up to the vendors, but also like to the general industry, educating a lot of the audience with fighting those misconceptions, like really putting those real life scenarios, how it helps, the security measures that there are in place, how it really helps with case studies, expert endorsements. I think with all of us working together on these, it really, SSI will also become kind of like the reference in terms of privacy of. So yeah, I think there are like a lot of resistance at the moment for uneducated users, or like there is always fear of the new, but it's just about going head on and not trying to just avoid it or work around it, but just go head on. Like, we don't have anything to lose, to show you. You can try with real life. The case studies, I think, like success stories are like the best way to show like how this will translate into the real world. Because I think with SSI, what happens sometimes is that we are not seeing the real uses.
And there is something that struck me when you mentioned digital identity being weaponized. It is true that perhaps a couple of years ago, it was kind of a veto topic for governments, somehow like a political suicide. It's not something that politicians want to enter into because it's a very sensitive concept in the end. In many countries, there are multiple public organizations dealing with identity and digital identity. So it's a complex topic when dealing at national level. And we observed a couple of years back some resistance from individual countries. Now, I think that what has changed is that there is, I would say, even a global movement towards this approach that involves many other stakeholders, not only national governments responsible for executing in the region, but also higher regulators, standardization organizations, multiple stakeholders like technology vendors, of course. There are many people advocating for this architecture, and that somehow provides the necessary safeguards for all of these national governments to then go ahead and execute a national strategy. So I do think that it could have become a weapon somehow, politically speaking, but not anymore. I think we've survived that. And in any case, digital identity has always had these cycles of hype. We're now at probably the top of one of the most recent hypes, but this is cyclical. Probably in 10 years' time, digital identity is already a very used topic. We will be into something else. And so many people will be paying attention to that beyond us, that we will be executing on what we're building today. But today is a very, very hot topic that has become more than a weapon. I would say like a political advantage even.
Yeah, I think from a European context, definitely. I think one thing that's perhaps helped, if I compare what's happening in the European market versus in North America, is that there was a little bit more early adoption or advancement in different nation states of digital identity programs under the EIDAS 1.0 regulation. And so you look at different countries, and whether it's like IDs coming from the banking system or just from governments or whatever, every country in the EU has their different adoption story. But I feel that's perhaps something that in the Canadian or North American market that we struggle with a little bit more, because we hadn't seen that same adoption. And then when COVID hit and you got all this rhetoric around government overreaching and all these different things being weaponized just because, I think we're perhaps in a bit of a different state than the European Union. But it's interesting to learn from what's happening in that continent. Let's shift a bit. I think we could cover communication in SSI a little bit more, but I'd like to shift perhaps to the role of UX or user experience in SSI adoption. And so I think it's a very broad topic, so hopefully we could start just nailing in on some key points. But maybe let's just start with, what are some UX challenges to date that either of you have noticed in the SSI space that needs perhaps a little bit more looking after?
Yeah. Perhaps to provide some more context on user experience, for us, it has been one of our 3 core values, together with security and privacy. And somehow we feel that in this space, people acknowledge the importance of user experience in adoption, but not really many people are working towards this. So just to provide some context, there is a paper I read 5 years ago or so, which is called the Digital Privacy Paradox. Christian Catalini was one of a professor at MIT, and they draw three main conclusions from this paper. I'm happy to provide the link afterwards. But one that really struck me is that people say that the paradox is that people say that they care a lot about privacy, but they're really willing to relinquish their private data very easily if incentivized to do so. So what really concerns me is that we're all working towards making the world, authentication much more private and providing control for the end user. But then how we really design the system can really achieve the contrary. And there are people that could exploit just the opposite by designing a specific user experience that makes it easy for users to just give up on their privacy. And a very nice example of these are the cookies. Like there is a regulation that says, hey, if you want to present a cookie for European customers or end users, you really need to explain and get an active consent from the user. But then the way you define that, it has been made so that the easy choice is to just accept all cookies. So that's a clear example on how clear user experience design can really change everything, including adoption. And the second finding from this paper was what I was mentioning right now, like basically that small navigation costs have a very tangible effect on how privacy protective consumers' choices are. So when we look into that and we say, okay, we've worked so hard, like everyone working, governments, regulators, standardization organizations, vendor providers are working for years so hard in making this happen, and then you disregard user experience completely, you can really get the opposite effect from either non-adoption to a type of adoption you really don't want. And that it's implemented by verifiers exploiting the loopholes. So this is why we've been insisting in the industry that user experience is so important. In particular to ensure adoption, of course, but also to make sure that the results are as intended. So when we talk about the challenges in UX, there are many. I would say that the first one is how do you have a balancing act between usability and security? Somehow they seem to be always in contradiction or in fight. If you want to build something hyper secure, then for some reason it's never usable. And the other way around, seems like everything that's so easy to use somehow is not secure. And that's something that we need to break. And that was one of our core missions. Like, let's not have to compromise any of them, nor usability, nor security, improve the other one. And that's one of the challenges in UX, how you make something that is hyper secure, super easy to use. Another one that I would say is simplicity versus choice. Because SSI somehow is providing or giving back control to the end user, and that means taking responsibility. And taking responsibility implies making choices, making active choices. And somehow providing too many choices to the end user implies either a very deep education on the topic or just that it will probably be abandoned. That's the abandonment rates that we see in many complex onboarding processes, because they have to be secure, but they're so complex. So simplicity has to be there, but also you need to provide the choice to the end user, their active choice and the control. That's the second challenge that we see. And that has an easier fix, I would say. Default values, trying to guide the end user to have everything kind of pre-configured, but also the ability to change those configurations. That's one way to go. And I would say that third is that we're talking about a breaking change. It's literally, we're changing radically the way we onboard into digital services. And we're so used to do it in one way, username, password. It's very difficult to insert a breaking change in this so core process that we've been using for years, if not decades. So how do you invite the end user into trying this something new is another challenge from UX. And there are more kind of technical challenges for user experience. One we like to somehow highlight is the graphical representation of complex verifier credentials. And we came across this specific UX challenge a couple of years ago when we were requested to represent a transcript of records type of credential. So in the higher education space, we were testing a student exchange scenario between two universities in different countries. And in Europe, there is this Erasmus exchange program in which students can simply study for 6 months or 1 year in another university in another country. But then the student records have to be exchanged between the universities. And today is crazy, all paper-based, really cumbersome for both the universities and the students. And so we were trying to test how could we represent those student records in the form of a verifier credential. And so we could automatize all these exchange process between the different universities with the student in the middle. Now, the challenge came, okay, how do you represent such a complex credential that has like 7 levels of depth in a JSON file? How do you represent that in a wallet? And it is just an example I wanted to highlight, because UX choices that we made at the time to represent that can hinder on interoperability. So it's not a matter of one single vendor making UX choices. UX can also impact on interoperability, and how wallet represents different credentials have to be somehow aligned between different vendors so that we can enable that wallet choice into the end user. So UX is not only now about driving adoption, but also to ensure interoperability at global scale. So in a nutshell, there are so many different challenges in UX, and yet so critical and so not well managed yet that we believe we need to put a focus already.
It would be nice to go a bit deeper into the interoperability topic. Then I have some other questions. But so you said UX impacts interoperability. Is the reverse true as well, that just the need for interoperability will impact how UX is done? So maybe just a bit more about interoperability, and then I have some other questions.
Well, that's a good reflection. I would say yes, definitely interoperability will impact on UX, because you will be constrained somehow in some aspects, but that's an easier fix. How you represent something once the basis has been agreed upon, it's easier than the other way around, because in standards, there are still so many things in the air that have not been agreed, or they don't have the level of depth that is required to actually build a final product, that there are a lot of choices that need to be made by vendors. So I think the problem is more the other way around, on how active UX choices can impact on future interoperability.
The other thing too, I kind of asked the question earlier about the brand recognition in the space and how to communicate or use that, or is there going to be a difference in how brands are recognized versus perhaps other spaces? But if you have kind of these common graphic representations of like high value credentials or credentials, and people align on that, it seems like there needs to be some open source shared model there. But perhaps that's where, as you mentioned earlier, there'll be certifications for wallets and stuff like that, but also like there could be trust marks within like the credentials themselves, right? And perhaps that is a way that if I'm using a wallet and I see that they support that brand recognition that is going to be built around these trust marks or these credential graphics or whatever it is, maybe that's kind of more of a way that wallet providers or digital credential providers are really able to leverage that to increase the trust of their own kind of products?
Well, certainly abiding to standards already provides some trust to that vendor. And nobody in this market wants to have a vendor logging, except for some vendors, maybe. But I think yes, the adoption of standards is kind of giving this brand stamp that you're seeking. I don't think this will be done because you're adopting some specific UX guideline on representing a specific credential. Is more about the product overall, whether you abide to specific security specifications or standards. But definitely there's some kind of homogeneous way of representing specific credentials. The fact that you can store this specific type of credential in that standardized way in your wallet is implicitly saying, hey, you can trust me. So it definitely can help. I'm not sure whether we will arrive to that point in the short term.
So we all, as a community in the space, there's some alignment on standards that we use and technologies that we use to do our implementations. There's different variations, there's different types, but I think there are we could probably count on our hands now how many different options are available and that people are converging around.
Yep.
All of these things are kind of open and worked on by communities. What needs to be opened and worked on by communities when it comes to user experience that is just not there today?
Well, we actually initiated an international working group precisely to provide an answer to that question. We called it the UX for SSI working group. We launched it a few months back, and we're trying to make it as open and interoperable as possible, even requesting the Decentralized Identity Foundation to host for us one channel for general discussions. And the objective in our mind is to develop and define a standardized guideline for UX in SSI, so as to define best practices and create some guidelines on how to do things, mostly to ensure two things. First is not to impact on interoperability, so not in a sense to make sure that interoperability that standard organizations and regulators are so hard working on are not just gone to nuts because the UX is not compatible. So those guidelines definitely aim at ensuring interoperability, but also to establish some UX best practices for end users to receive an homogeneous messaging on how SSI works, because that will definitely ease adoption. If its SSI vendor provides a completely different solution represented in a completely different way, I think it will be very confusing for the end user. And getting into, in the end, we will converge. But if we can work together towards achieving that conversion early on, I think that will be in favor of the whole ecosystem.
That seems like perhaps the biggest challenge out of the list that you went through earlier is perhaps the usability versus security aspect versus when you talked about simplicity versus choice. I think if we use social media platforms, to some extent you can imagine you join and it just works, but I could go into account settings or permissions and go more granular if I want to. So I do have that choice. Perhaps it would be a similar kind of model in the SSI space. I think that changing consumer behaviors is never easy, but it seems like there's probably learnings that could come from other spaces that have gone through digital transformations or different kind of user habits, trying something new and adopting that. But the usability versus security, perhaps, maybe I'm wrong, but that seems like one of the bigger challenges that as a community working on it together and making open implementations or recommendations and stuff like that would be very valuable.
Interested. Definitely duly noted. We will bring that up in our next session next Tuesday for the community that has already joined the group.
Awesome. And then for anyone that is looking to join this, I will in the show notes we'll leave some instructions on how to contact you both and how to get in touch with the organizers of this group. And we'll also put a link of the paper that you referenced earlier around privacy. It just feels like showing the value of privacy is difficult. You mentioned I'm personally guilty of doing this too. Like I'll use products and stuff where I know very well that I'm not super happy with what's happening with my data, but I'm very much willing to accept it just because the product is good. So I think being able to see like some positive reinforcements in products when you're doing something to be shown, hey, like this is very good for your privacy or whatever, like that'll be something that'll be interesting to be able to show through products.
I agree. There is another example that was just coming to my mind, which is the famous QRs. So the QR code in SSI seems to be a core component. And somehow what we've been seeing in the market, because of this lack of UX guidelines, is that companies is doing their own QR code representation. And as such, what's happening is the same thing as what's happening in Web 2.0, which is what do you want to sign up with Google, with Facebook, with LinkedIn, and then you have, in this case, a rather short list of choices. But with wallets, it can happen that we have a choice of 20, 50 wallets. So somehow it doesn't seem reasonable to make users, each time they want to sign up or sign in, to have a drop-down menu of 50 choices until they find their own wallet of choice. So if we could come up with a common design for those QR codes that could be read by all wallets, and that implies for some technical components, there's some technical interoperability specifications that need to be defined, but there's also some UX behind all of that and what data is expected so that the wallet can read it and how the wallet represents that data in the QR code. So those guidelines are also very important. So in this case, the user could just see a QR code that they could scan with any wallet. We could save a lot of UX, complications. So that's yet another example of how UX can really impact on adoption and usability.
And then even on the device itself, like if I scan a QR code and I have like 5-10 different wallets that perhaps have credentials that I could present to there, like how to from a privacy security perspective, then like how do you even go through, do you even want your device to start looking around and seeing what's there, because now you've kind of opened that up, all of your apps to one central place. There's a lot of complexities when we think about how to make things easy.
Agree.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Metzer Glode on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.